Cheryl Jordan had spent the last 6 months perfecting the delicate balance of single motherhood while maintaining her career as a freelance architectural consultant. Her transition to a new life in a new city depended on the quiet success of this cross-country flight and her ability to keep her infant son, Leo, calm in the cramped confines of Seat 5B. The soft hum of the business-class engines cast a hypnotic drone over a cabin filled with passengers worth millions of dollars. Somewhere just across the aisle, the man with the gold rings and neck tattoos, Franco Baccio, sat like a coiled predator, his silent, wide-eyed daughter Gia clutched to his chest as if she were the only thing keeping his dark empire from collapsing into the clouds. The air in the business-class cabin was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the altitude. At 35,000 feet, the world usually felt distant and manageable, but for Franco Baccio, the confines of Seat 4A felt smaller than a prison cell. He leaned forward, his muscular frame straining against the fine fabric of his charcoal suit. The gold rings on his fingers caught the dim cabin light as he adjusted the silk blanket draped over his daughter, Gia. Gia was 3 years old, a porcelain doll with dark, haunting eyes that seemed to look through everything and everyone. For 6 months, those eyes had been her only form of communication. Since the night the world had turned red and her mother had been stolen from them, Gia had retreated into a fortress of silence. "Gia, Kara, look," Franco whispered, his voice a gravelly rumble that usually made grown men tremble. He held up a small, silver music box, its melody tinkling softly against the low hum of the jet engines. "Your favorite. Don't you want to hear it?" The little girl didn't blink. She sat rigidly against the leather seat, her tiny hands gripped together in her lap. Franco felt a familiar, sharp pang of helplessness, a sensation he loathed. He was a man who moved mountains with a phone call, a man who commanded a small army with a nod of his head. He had the power to burn cities, yet he couldn't coax a single syllable from the person who mattered most. His jaw clenched, the tattoos on his neck shifting as the muscles tightened. He felt the weight of the crown he wore, the invisible burden of the Baccio legacy that demanded he be a god, even when he felt like a failing father. Across the aisle, in Seat 5B, the atmosphere was entirely different. Cheryl Jordan didn't notice the dark-eyed man's silent struggle at first. She was focused entirely on the small, warm weight in her arms. Her son, Leo, was barely 4 months old, a bundle of soft sighs and rhythmic movements. Cheryl moved with a practiced, fluid grace, her blonde hair escaping its low ponytail in soft wisps around her face. She adjusted the nursing cover with a calm efficiency that suggested she had found her center long ago. As she nursed Leo, Cheryl projected an aura of profound peace. It was a stillness she had fought hard to cultivate after a year of upheaval. To her, this flight was more than just travel. It was a bridge to a new life, a fresh start where she wouldn't have to look over her shoulder. She hummed a low, tuneless melody, her thumb tracing the curve of Leo's cheek. She was the picture of maternal serenity, a stark contrast to the jagged, dark energy radiating from the man across from her. Franco found himself staring. It wasn't the voyeuristic gaze of a stranger, but the desperate hunger of a starving man watching a feast. He watched how Cheryl's shoulders were relaxed, how her expression remained soft and unburdened even as her baby shifted. He looked back at Gia, whose knuckles were white. The silence between them felt like a canyon he couldn't cross. He felt a surge of irrational irritation. Why did this woman get to have peace? Why did her child seem so content while his own daughter was a ghost in a living body? He leaned back, his rings clicking against the armrest, his intense stare fixed on Cheryl. He took in the simple white button-down shirt, the lack of expensive jewelry, and the way she seemed completely unfazed by the opulence of the cabin, or the dangerous aura he knew he projected. Cheryl finally looked up. Her blue eyes met Franco's dark, predatory gaze. Most people, when faced with Franco Baccio's full attention, looked away or began to sweat. Cheryl did neither. She saw the slicked-back hair, the thick beard, and the "you will be mine" intensity written in his posture. But she also saw the slight tremble in his hand as he reached out to touch his daughter's hair. She saw the raw, unfiltered frustration of a parent who was losing a battle they didn't understand. She didn't pull away. Instead, she offered him a small, empathetic nod, the kind shared between parents in the trenches of a long night. It was a gesture of solidarity that Franco didn't know how to process. He felt a flicker of curiosity pierce through his dominance. Who was this woman who looked at Adon and saw only a struggling father? Gia shifted then. For the first time during the flight, her head turned. She wasn't looking at the music box or the window. Her wide, dark eyes were locked on Cheryl and the baby in her arms. The toddler's breath hitched, a small, ragged sound that made Franco's heart skip a beat. The silence of the cabin felt heavier now, charged with a new kind of electricity. Franco watched, breathless, as Gia's tiny hand slowly released its grip on the seat. She leaned toward the aisle, her gaze fixed on the calm woman who seemed to carry a piece of the sun in her arms. Franco didn't move. He didn't breathe. He simply watched, his possessive instincts warring with a desperate hope he hadn't felt in months. Cheryl noticed the little girl's attention. She didn't stop nursing Leo, but she shifted slightly, allowing Gia a better view of the sleeping infant. She gave the toddler a soft, encouraging smile, the kind of smile that promised safety. The plane banked slightly, the golden afternoon light flooding the cabin and illuminating the tattoos on Franco's hands. He sat like a statue, a man of violence caught in a moment of pure, domestic vulnerability. He didn't know it yet, but the architectural consultant in 5B had already begun to dismantle the walls of his empire, simply by refusing to walk away from the silence. The golden hour light shifted as the plane began its long descent, casting long, amber shadows across the cabin that seemed to dance over the tattoos on Franco's hands. The silence in the business class section was no longer sterile. It was heavy, vibrating with the unspoken connection between two rows of seats. Franco remained frozen, his gaze darting between the serene woman across the aisle and his daughter. He saw the way Gia's small frame had softened, the jagged tension that usually lived in her shoulders finally giving way to a curious tilt of her head. Cheryl, sensing the profound fragility of the moment, didn't move. She kept her breathing steady, a rhythmic anchor for both the infant at her breast and the broken toddler watching her. She knew that for a child like Gia, sudden movements were like glass, easily shattered. Leo had drifted into a deep, milk-drunk sleep, his tiny face pressed against Cheryl's warmth. Gia's hand, small and pale, reached out toward the aisle. Her fingers brushed the air as if trying to catch the melody Cheryl had been humming. Franco felt a lump form in his throat, a physical manifestation of the hope he had tried to bury to protect himself from disappointment. He watched as Gia's lips parted, not in the familiar O shape of a silent cry, but with the effort of a soul trying to find its way back to the surface. The sound, when it finally came, was no louder than the rustle of silk, yet it hit Franco with the force of an explosion. Mama. The word hung in the pressurized air, shimmering with impossible weight. The flight attendant, who had been moving toward the galley, stopped dead in her tracks. A businessman 2 rows up lowered his newspaper, the crinkle of the pages sounding like a gunshot in the sudden stillness. Franco's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He leaned closer, his voice a ragged whisper. Gia? What did you say, princess? Gia didn't look at her father. Her eyes remained locked on Cheryl, wide and brimming with a sudden, overwhelming clarity. She pointed a trembling finger at the woman in the white button-down shirt. Mama, she said again, this time louder, her voice gaining strength as if the word itself were a lifeline. Mama, hungry. A collective gasp rippled through the few passengers who were watching. To them, it was a heartwarming moment of a child confused by a kind stranger. But to Franco, it was a seismic shift in the universe. He knew the history. He knew that Gia's last memory of her mother was a nightmare of fire and sirens. For her to use that word, to bestow that title upon a woman she had never met, wasn't just a mistake. It was a claim. Cheryl felt a chill race down her spine. She looked at the little girl, then at the man whose dark eyes were now glistening with an emotion that bordered on terrifying. She saw the possessive flare in Franco's nostrils, the way his rings dug into the armrest as he realized the magnitude of what had just happened. She was a mother. She understood the primal need in Gia's voice. But she was also a woman who knew the world, and she recognized the dangerous look on Franco's face. He wasn't just relieved, he was deciding. "I'm sorry," Cheryl whispered, her voice trembling slightly as she gently shifted Leo. She must be mistaking me for someone else." "She doesn't make mistakes," Franco said, his voice dropping into that dangerous, silky tone that signaled the end of a negotiation. He stood up, his towering height suddenly making the cabin feel claustrophobic. He stepped into the aisle, blocking the path of the flight attendant, his focus entirely on Cheryl. Gia began to scramble out of her seat, her small shoes thumping against the carpet. She didn't head for her father. She headed for Cheryl. She reached the edge of seat 5B and buried her face in the denim of Cheryl's jeans, her small hands clutching at the fabric. "Mama," she sobbed, a raw, guttural sound of release. "Mama, stay." Cheryl's heart broke. Every instinct she possessed told her to scoop the child up, to comfort the motherless girl who had finally found her voice in the most public and painful way possible. But as she looked up, she met Franco's gaze. The "you will be mine" intensity she had seen earlier had transformed into something more permanent. He wasn't looking at her as a passenger anymore. He was looking at her as a missing piece of his life that had just been found. "You heard her," Franco said, his voice low and vibrating with a terrifying kind of gratitude. "She hasn't spoken in half a year. Not a word. Not for doctors, not for me. And now she calls for you." I'm just a stranger," Cheryl stammered, feeling the walls of her carefully planned new life closing in. "Not anymore," Franco replied. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a heavy, embossed card, but he didn't hand it to her. He held it like a vow. "In my world, when the child of a dawn names a mother, the heavens listen. And so do I." As the fasten seatbelt sign chimed for their final approach, Cheryl looked down at the toddler clinging to her knees, and then up at the man who looked ready to move the world to keep her right where she was. She realized with a sinking, electric jolt that the plane might be landing, but for her, the real journey into the heart of the Butcho Empire had just begun. She couldn't walk away. Not from the girl, and, as Franco's shadow fell over her, not from him. The wheels met the tarmac with a jarring thud that sent a ripple of motion through the cabin, but for Cheryl, the world had already stopped moving. Gia's small, warm body was a heavy anchor against her legs, the child's sobbing breath slowly evening out into a fragile, exhausted peace. Above them, Franco stood like a shadow cast in granite. He didn't reach down to pull his daughter away. Instead, he placed a protective, heavy hand on the headrest of Cheryl's seat, effectively claiming the air around her. As the plane taxied toward a private terminal away from the main gates, the other passengers began to scurry, eager to escape the suffocating intensity of seat 4A. Franco ignored them. His focus was a laser, pinned entirely on the woman who was currently holding his world together. "You have to let go, sweetheart," Cheryl whispered, her voice thick with a mix of maternal ache and rising alarm. She gently tried to pry Gia's fingers from her denim, but the toddler only tightened her grip, a soft whimper escaping her lips. "I have to get my things. I have to take Leo home." "Home is a relative concept now, Cheryl Jordan," Franco said. The sound of her full name coming from his lips made her skin prickle. She hadn't given it to him. She looked up, her blue eyes wide with realization. "You've already looked me up. In the time it took for the wheels to touch down, you've already invaded my life." "I have protected my life," Franco corrected, his voice dropping into a register that made the floor of the cabin vibrate. He sat on the edge of the vacant seat next to her, leaning in until she could smell the expensive sandalwood and the faint, cold scent of gunpowder that seemed to cling to his suit. 6 months of silence, Cheryl. 6 months of my daughter fading away before my eyes. And then she looks at you and finds her voice. Do you have any idea what that means in my world? It means she needs a therapist or a grief counselor, Cheryl countered, her voice trembling but firm. It doesn't mean you get to hover over me like a... In the Butcho family, we do not believe in coincidences, Franco interrupted, his intense stare never wavering. We believe in blood, and we believe in the word. My daughter is the crown of my organization. She is the only thing I have left of a woman who was taken from me by cowards. When Gia calls a woman mama in public, she isn't just making a mistake. She is issuing a decree. She is placing you under the protection of the Black Hand. Cheryl felt the air leave her lungs. I don't want your protection. I'm a consultant. I have a life, a son, a future that doesn't involve whatever it is you do. Franco's expression didn't soften, but a flicker of something that might have been respect passed through his dark eyes. He looked down at Leo, who was starting to stir in Cheryl's arms, then back at Gia, who was now looking up at them both with wide, expectant eyes. Listen to me very carefully, Franco said, his hand moving to trace the gold ring on his pinky. Word of what happened on this flight is already moving. My enemies, men who would peel the skin from my bones if they thought it would give them an inch of my territory, now know that a stranger has broken Gia's silence. They will see you as my heart. They will see you as a target to be used against me. Cheryl felt a cold sweat break across her forehead. You're saying, just because she spoke to me, I'm in danger? I am saying that you are mine, Franco said, the words ringing with a terrifying, possessive finality. Not because I want to cage you, but because the moment she spoke that word, your old life ended. If you walk out of this airport alone, you won't make it to your front door. My world is one of ancient codes and violent debts. Gia has claimed you. That makes you sacred. It makes you a Butcho. He stood up as the cabin door hissed open, revealing a phalanx of men in dark suits waiting on the tarmac. They didn't look like airport security. They looked like a small, lethal army. Franco reached down, not to take Gia, but to offer his hand to Cheryl. It was an invitation that felt remarkably like a command. You have a choice, Cheryl. You can try to fight the tide and risk that boy in your arms, or you can step into the shadow I provide. I will give you everything. I will house you. I will guard your son with my own life, and I will pay any price to keep that smile on my daughter's face. Cheryl looked at Gia, who reached up and tucked a stray lock of Cheryl's blonde hair behind her ear. The toddler's touch was so light, so desperate for affection, that Cheryl felt her resistance crumbling. She looked at Leo, sleeping peacefully, unaware that his mother was about to step into a den of lions. I'm not a mama for hire, Franco, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I'm not hiring you, Franco replied, his forward-leaning posture suggesting he was already preparing to shield her from the world. I'm keeping you, because for the first time in 6 months, my daughter isn't alone. And neither am I. With a heavy heart and a surging sense of inevitability, Cheryl took his hand. His grip was warm, calloused, and unyielding. As they stepped out into the bright, blinding light of the tarmac, Franco's men formed a literal wall around them, a human shield that signaled the beginning of her life in the golden cage of the Butcho Empire. The silent passenger had spoken, and in doing so, she had rewritten Cheryl's destiny in blood and gold. The blacked-out SUV glided through the wrought iron gates of the Butcho estate like a shark returning to its reef. As the vehicle wound up the long, serpentine driveway, Cheryl looked out the window, her hand instinctively tightening around the handle of Leo's car seat. The landscape was a masterpiece of controlled beauty, perfectly manicured hedges, ancient oaks that stood like sentinels, and a fountain of white marble that seemed to weep into a basin of turquoise water. But behind every tree and at every corner of the stone wall, she spotted the glint of sunlight on tactical gear. The beauty was a mask. The reality was a fortress. It's too much, Cheryl whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft hum of the air conditioning. It is necessary, Franco replied. He sat beside her, his posture relaxed yet dominant, his dark eyes watching the way the shadows of the trees flickered across her face. Gia was asleep in a specialized toddler seat between them, her small hand still clutching the hem of Cheryl's sleeve even in slumber. In this world, Cheryl, the only thing more dangerous than having no power is having something worth losing. And today, I have doubled my risks. The SUV came to a halt in front of a sprawling Mediterranean villa that looked as though it had been plucked from the Sicilian coast and dropped into the American countryside. The front doors, carved from dark, heavy oak, swung open before the engine had even died. A line of staff and security stood in a perfect, silent row. Franco stepped out first, his presence immediately commanding the space. He didn't wait for a valet. He opened Cheryl's door himself, offering his hand. As she stepped out onto the heated cobblestones, carrying Leo in his carrier, the air felt different, thicker, charged with the weight of old money and older blood. "Welcome to the cage," Franco said, though there was no humor in his voice. The interior of the mansion was a dizzying display of marble and light. Vaulted ceilings reached toward the heavens, painted with frescoes that whispered of ancient wars and divine protection. The floors were polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the grim faces of the armed men stationed at every arched doorway. Cheryl felt small, exposed despite the walls. A woman in her late 50s, dressed in a sharp black suit with her hair pulled into a bun so tight it looked painful, stepped forward. "Everything is prepared, Don Butcho. The nursery has been mirrored for the second child, and the guest wing has been secured." "This is Teresa," Franco said, nodding toward the woman. "She is the only person in this house, besides myself, who you can trust implicitly. She handled Gia's mother's care. She will handle yours." Cheryl followed Teresa up a grand staircase that felt like a climb into another dimension. Every few feet, a man with a holstered sidearm and an earpiece offered a sharp, respectful nod as Franco passed. It was a jarring contrast to the life Cheryl had been living, one of grocery lists, freelance deadlines, and quiet park walks. Here, her every breath was monitored, her every movement a tactical variable. Teresa led them to a suite that took Cheryl's breath away. It was a sprawling expanse of cream silks and soft velvets. Through an adjoining door, she could see a nursery that had been transformed. Her own equipment, the diaper bag, the portable crib she had checked at the gate, was already there, laid out alongside hand-carved Italian furniture and toys that cost more than her car. "I need to call my sister," Cheryl said, turning to Franco as he lingered in the doorway. "She'll be expecting me to check in. If I don't, she'll call the police." "The police are a complication we don't need," Franco said, stepping into the room. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound heavy and final. "Teresa has a secure line. You will call her. You will tell her you've taken a high-paying, live-in consultancy job for a private client. You will tell her you are safe. That is all." "And if I refuse?" Cheryl challenged, her heart racing. "If I want to leave right now?" Franco walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped just inches away, the scent of expensive leather and something metallic, perhaps the gold of his rings, perhaps the steel of his intent, filling her senses. He reached out, his thumb grazing the soft skin of Leo's cheek as the infant slept, then moved to Cheryl's chin, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. "Then you walk out into a world that knows you are the woman who made the Butcho heiress speak," he said softly. "My enemies do not have my restraint, Cheryl. They would not give you a marble room. They would give you a shallow grave to get to me." He let his hand drop, but the heat of his touch lingered. "Gia is waking up. She will be looking for her, Mama. I suggest you make yourself at home. This house is a fortress, and as long as you are in it, you and your son are the most protected people on this continent." As he turned to leave, Cheryl looked at the armed guard standing visible through the sheer curtains on the balcony. She was surrounded by luxury, pampered by staff, and held by the strongest man she had ever met. But as the heavy door settled into its frame, the click of the lock echoed in her mind. It was a beautiful room, a masterpiece of architecture and comfort, but as Leo let out a small, hungry whimper, Cheryl realized the truth. The bars were made of gold, but it was a cage nonetheless. The morning sun didn't so much enter the nursery as it did bleed into it, filtered through heavy, cream-colored silk curtains that kept the outside world at a distance. Cheryl sat in a velvet rocking chair, the rhythmic creak of the floorboards under the runner providing the only soundtrack to the morning. In her left arm, Leo was tucked snugly, his tiny fingers curled into the collar of her shirt as he finished his morning feed. In her right arm, Gia was pressed close, her head resting against Cheryl's shoulder with a trust that felt both miraculous and terrifying. It had been 3 days since their arrival at the estate. The transition from the chaotic, noise-filled life of a freelancer to the hushed, gilded stillness of the Butcho mansion was jarring. Yet, in this room, the boundaries of the estate seemed to melt away. Here, the only thing that mattered was the weight of the 2 children and the primal necessity of their care. Cheryl found herself moving in a trance of efficiency, a soft dance of burp cloths, bottles, and quiet murmurs that bridged the gap between the 2 vastly different lives she was now straddling. Gia was a cautious child, her movements deliberate and watchful, as if she were still expecting the world to shatter again. But every time Cheryl hummed a lullaby or brushed a stray dark curl from the toddler's forehead, the tension in Gia's small frame ebbed just a little further. Cheryl had discovered that Gia didn't just want to be held, she wanted to be included. If Cheryl sang to Leo, Gia wanted to be part of the melody. If Cheryl changed Leo's diaper, Gia watched with intense focus, eventually handing over the clean wipes with a solemnity that made Cheryl's heart ache. It was a delicate balance. Leo was all soft curves and instinctual demands, a creature of pure, unfiltered need. Gia, however, was a creature of survival. She was learning how to be a child again, a process that felt as fragile as spun glass. Cheryl found herself adjusting her own cadence to meet them both, her voice dropping into a register that felt like a sanctuary. She was no longer just Cheryl the consultant or Cheryl the grieving mother. She was a bridge, a vessel of calm in a house built on the foundations of cold, hard steel. There were moments when the mask of the house slipped. During the mid-afternoon, Cheryl walked down to the grand kitchen, the 2 children in tow, to find Franco standing at the island. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His white dress shirt was rolled to the elbows, exposing the intricate, dark ink that adorned his forearms. He was on the phone, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a shiver through the marble halls. "If they cross the border, you kill them," he said, his tone as detached as if he were discussing a weather report. "I don't care about the consequences. I don't care about their excuses. The estate is off limits. Period." He hung up, the silence that followed punctuated by the sudden clatter of a silver spoon dropping from Gia's hand. Franco spun around, his hand instinctively moving toward his waistband, his posture lethal. When he saw Cheryl and the children standing in the doorway, the ferocity in his eyes vanished, replaced by an expression of unguarded, almost painful relief. "You startled me," he said, his voice instantly softening. He looked at Gia, who was hovering behind Cheryl's legs, then at Leo, who was blissfully unaware of the violence lurking in the next room. "She's hungry." "She's fine," Cheryl said, walking toward the counter. She had learned over the last few days that Franco was a man who wanted to be involved but had no idea how to exist in a space that wasn't a battlefield. "She ate an hour ago. She's settling in." Franco moved toward them, his steps heavy and measured. He knelt down, ignoring the pristine white floor, until he was at eye level with Gia. He looked at her with a depth of affection that surprised Cheryl. It was the look of a man who would gladly burn the world down to keep the cold from touching her. "Did you have a good day with Mama?" he asked, the words sounding strange and heavy on his tongue. Gia nodded, her eyes wide, before she looked back at Cheryl. The look she gave her, one of absolute, unblinking devotion, made Cheryl realize the permanence of her situation. She wasn't just a nanny or a temporary guest. To Gia, she was a lifeline. And to Franco, she was becoming something else entirely. Cheryl realized then that she was no longer just caring for 2 children. She was trying to knit together a life for a man who had forgotten how to live. She saw the way Franco watched her, the way his gaze lingered on the way she handled Leo, the way she was teaching Gia how to play. He wasn't just looking at a mother. He was looking at the woman who was turning his fortress back into a home, even if the walls were still made of shadow. She had bridged the gap, and in doing so, she had become the center of a gravity she was beginning to fear she could never escape. The evening at the Butcho estate rarely followed the rhythms of the outside world. While the rest of the city wound down toward sleep, the mansion felt as though it were bracing for a long night of watchfulness. Cheryl had spent the better part of the day in the library, a room lined with leather-bound books that smelled of dust and unread history. It was there, hidden behind a heavy mahogany door, that she found Franco. He wasn't the man who dictated orders into a burner phone or the man who stared down his rivals across a boardroom table. He was sitting on a low, velvet-tufted ottoman, his back to the door, hunched over a collection of photographs spread across the coffee table. He had discarded his suit jacket, his shirt sleeves bunched at the elbows, revealing the intricate tapestry of ink on his skin. He held a small, silver picture frame in his calloused hands, his thumb tracing the glass with a reverence that felt heartbreaking. Cheryl hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorframe, but the soft creak of the floorboard gave her away. Franco didn't jump, but his posture shifted, the predator returning to the surface in a heartbeat. He turned his head, his dark eyes clouded with an exhaustion that went deeper than mere fatigue. "I didn't mean to intrude," Cheryl said, stepping back, but he waved a hand, a gesture that was dismissive yet strangely welcoming. "The house is yours, Cheryl. You don't need to ask for permission to move through it." He didn't put the picture away. He simply gestured to the table, where images of a woman with a bright, defiant smile and soft, dark hair stared back at them. She was standing in the very garden Cheryl had walked through that morning, looking toward the camera with a sense of joy that felt alien in this house of shadows. Her name was Elena, Franco said, his voice stripped of the gravelly menace he usually employed. She had a way of making the marble seem warm. When she laughed, the guards would stop pacing. Even the walls felt like they were breathing. Cheryl walked closer, her gaze drifting to the photos. She saw a younger Franco, less scarred, his eyes still bright with a life that hadn't yet been hardened by the weight of the crown. "She loved you very much," Cheryl noted, her own grief for the life she had left behind echoing his. "She died bringing Gia into this world," Franco said, his jaw tightening as he spoke the truth he had likely kept buried under layers of fury. "She was the only thing I ever had that was pure. And when I lost her, I realized that my power was just a pile of ash. I could control every port, every union, and every shipment, but I couldn't stop the cold from creeping into my daughter's heart." He looked at his hands, those hands that could dismantle an empire, and for the first time, Cheryl saw them shake. It was a fleeting tremor, a momentary lapse in the ironclad exterior he presented to the world, but it told her everything she needed to know. His ruthlessness, his possessiveness, the high walls of his estate, they weren't just about crime. They were a frantic, desperate attempt to build a dam against a river of grief. "I didn't know how to talk to Gia," he continued, his gaze drifting back to the photos. "Every time I looked at her, I saw Elena's eyes, but I also saw the reason Elena wasn't there. I became a ghost in my own home, watching my daughter turn into a ghost herself." Cheryl pulled a chair close to the table. She wanted to tell him that grief wasn't a battle to be won or a territory to be held, but a landscape that had to be walked through, slowly and without armor. She thought of the way Gia had latched onto her, how she had used the word, mama, not just to claim Cheryl, but to reclaim a piece of her own identity that had been buried in silence. "You tried to protect her by building a fortress," Cheryl said softly, reaching out to touch the edge of the photograph. "But you can't protect someone from the world by locking them in a cage. You have to show them that there's still light worth reaching for." Franco looked at her then, really looked at her, and the intensity of his stare was no longer about possession. It was about recognition. He saw in her not just a mother for his child, but a woman who understood the gravity of his loss because she, too, had been forced to rebuild her life from the ruins of her own pain. "I don't know how to be the man who lives in the light, Cheryl," he admitted, his voice barely a murmur. "I only know how to be the man who keeps the darkness at bay." "Then let me show you," she replied, the offer hanging in the room like a promise. For Gia. For Leo. And for yourself. In that moment, the shadows in the library seemed to recede. Franco looked like a man standing on the edge of a precipice, staring down at a path he had been too afraid to walk. He didn't say a word, but the way he let his shoulders drop, the way he finally put the photograph back on the table, suggested that the fortress gates were beginning to creak open. The shift in the atmosphere at the estate was subtle, like the sudden stillness before a hurricane, but Cheryl felt it in the way the guards moved. Their routine had tightened. The perimeter patrols were no longer just a display of force, but a genuine reaction to an unseen pressure. The news of the Butcho Queen had rippled through the underworld, crossing state lines and seeping into the boardrooms of men who viewed Franco's newfound domesticity as a fatal crack in his armor. For Cheryl, the mornings once spent in the quiet sanctuary of the nursery now felt like training for a siege. Franco had insisted that she and the children remain in the central wing, surrounded by reinforced glass and heavy steel. He was rarely seen without a weapon tucked into his waistband, his usual cold, calculated demeanor replaced by a hypervigilance that bordered on paranoia. One afternoon, while Cheryl was in the nursery trying to soothe a restless Leo, Teresa entered, her face drained of its usual stoic composure. She closed the heavy oak door and locked it, a sound that resonated with a finality that made Cheryl's blood run cold. "There has been a breach at the outer gate," Teresa said, her voice low and tight. "Not an attack, but a message. A courier arrived with a package, but it didn't come from any of our associates. It's for you, Signora." She placed a small, velvet-lined box on the changing table. Cheryl hesitated, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had stepped into this world to protect Gia and find a measure of safety, but the world of the Mafia was not one where peace could be negotiated. It was a currency that had to be paid for in blood. She opened the box. Inside lay a delicate, gold-spun necklace, but the pendant wasn't a gem. It was a jagged piece of obsidian shaped like a shrapnel shard. Beneath the jewelry was a note, written in an elegant, calligraphic hand that felt sinister in its precision. "The queen has no throne without the king. And the king is currently distracted. We are waiting for the harvest." "They know," Cheryl whispered, the realization settling over her like a shroud. "They know about the children. They know about me. They see a weakness where the dawn sees a future," Teresa replied, her eyes scanning the room as if checking for threats in the very shadows. "Franco believes his strength can shield you, but in this life, when a man finds something he loves, he stops being a warrior and starts being a hostage to his own heart. The Moretti family is moving. They don't want to kill him, Cheryl. They want to break him by taking the only thing that has finally made him human." The weight of the target on her back was suddenly tangible. Cheryl looked at Gia, who was playing with a set of wooden blocks on the rug, her laughter light and innocent. The toddler had no concept of the vultures circling their home, no understanding that her mama was now the primary tactical objective of a war that had been brewing for decades. Later that evening, the tension broke. Franco returned to the mansion, his suit jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves stained with the dust of the road. He went straight to the nursery, his eyes searching the room until they landed on Cheryl. He didn't speak, but he walked over and placed a heavy, gloved hand on the nursery door, his head bowing for a second. "They think they can play a game of chess with my family," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that lacked the softness he had shown her in the library. "They think that by threatening you I will retreat. They don't understand that I haven't been playing this game to win. I've been playing to survive. And for the first time, I have something worth dying for." Cheryl felt a surge of fear, not for herself, but for the man who was standing before her, teetering on the edge of a total war. She stood up, shielding Leo with her body as if her own frame could deflect the oncoming storm. "If you fight them, you'll lose everything you've built, Franco. You'll be the same man you were before, alone in the dark." "I am already in the dark, Cheryl," he replied, his gaze meeting hers with a terrifying, absolute clarity. "But for the first time, I'm not alone. And that is why I will burn their world to the ground before I let them lay a finger on you or the children." The queen title wasn't an honor, It was a death sentence waiting to be signed. As Franco turned and exited the room, leaving a detail of 3 guards at her door, Cheryl looked out the window at the high, electrified fences of the estate. The mansion was no longer a golden cage. It was a battleground, and she was the stake in a high-stakes gamble that could destroy them all. The silence that had defined the Butcho estate was shattered not by a scream, but by the hollow, metallic thud of a perimeter sensor dying. It was a sound Cheryl had learned to fear, the sound of the fortress losing its eyes. Inside the nursery, the air went cold. The overhead lights flickered once, then vanished, plunging the room into a deep, claustrophobic gloom illuminated only by the frantic sweep of a security light outside. "Teresa," Cheryl called out, her voice barely a breath. The older woman was already moving, her hand on a hidden panel behind the mahogany bookshelf. She didn't look back. She simply gestured for Cheryl to move. "They're through the south gate," Teresa said, her voice a calm, jagged blade of steel. "Franco is already at the foyer. You have to go. Now." Cheryl didn't argue. She grabbed the lightweight tactical carrier she had prepared days ago, a backpack containing formula, water, and the 2 heavy, weighted blankets she used to muffle the children's sounds. She strapped Leo to her chest and scooped Gia into her arms, the toddler's eyes wide and glassy with fear. Gia didn't cry. She pressed her face into Cheryl's neck, a silent, trembling weight. They descended into the belly of the house, moving through the service corridors that smelled of copper and cold concrete. Behind them, the house began to groan under the assault. The sounds of heavy, rhythmic gunfire echoed up through the vents, muffled and distant, but unmistakable. Each shot was a heartbeat of the life Cheryl had been trying to escape, a reminder that the shadow Franco cast was broad enough to swallow them all. "The tunnel is behind the wine cellar," Teresa instructed, pushing a heavy steel plate that slid aside to reveal a pitch-black chute. "It leads to the forest road. A driver is waiting. Don't stop for anything." "What about you?" Cheryl asked, pausing at the threshold of the dark passage. "I am the keeper of this house," Teresa said, her expression hardening. "Go." Cheryl plunged into the dark. The air inside the tunnel was stale and smelled of damp earth. She moved with a desperate, frantic agility, her boots skidding on the slick floor. The sounds of the battle above grew muffled, then suddenly loud as she neared the ventilation grates that ran along the ceiling. She caught glimpses of the mansion's interior through the slats, dark-clad figures sweeping through the grand hall, their weapons raised, moving with the practiced, predatory grace of men who had done this 1,000 times. She heard Franco's voice then, a roar of pure, unadulterated fury that cut through the sound of shattering glass. He was fighting in the gallery, the room where the photos of Elena were kept. She heard the grunt of impact, the sound of bodies hitting the marble floor, and the sickening, singular sound of a slide racking on a handgun. Franco was protecting their path, buying them seconds with his own life, turning the mansion into a meat grinder to ensure they reached the exit. Cheryl pushed harder. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her lungs burning, but she kept her gaze fixed on the sliver of moonlight at the end of the tunnel. Gia was a dead weight in her arms, her small fingers digging into Cheryl's skin, while Leo remained unnervingly still against her chest. Every muscle in Cheryl's body screamed for rest, but the image of the obsidian shard pendant flickered in her mind, fueling her with a frantic, protective rage. They reached the heavy iron door at the tunnel's end. It was locked, a massive bolt holding it in place. Cheryl fumbled with the mechanism, her fingers shaking so violently she could barely feel the cold metal. She kicked the door, once, twice, before the bolt slid free with a rusted, ear-piercing screech. She tumbled out into the cool, damp night air of the forest, the sudden space and lack of walls feeling like a physical blow. She scrambled toward the edge of the tree line, where a nondescript black sedan waited, its engine idling with a low, predatory purr. She slammed the door shut, the sound echoing through the trees like a gunshot. "Drive," she screamed at the driver, who didn't wait for a second instruction. As the car accelerated, throwing up a cloud of gravel, Cheryl looked back. The Butcho mansion was a silhouette against the night sky, a dark crown burning at the edges. She watched the flickers of gunfire through the windows, a silent, lethal symphony of lights. Franco was still inside, fighting to erase the threat to his children, a man made of shadow trying to buy a future for the people who had finally taught him how to love. She gripped the children tight, her knuckles white, and turned her head away from the fire. The survival of the Butcho legacy was no longer a question of power, it was a race against the dawn. The forest road was a blur of obsidian shadows and moonlight, but Cheryl didn't look back. She clutched Leo and Gia against her chest, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs that matched the car's speeding engine. Hours bled into one another until the sleek black sedan pulled onto a secluded estate property miles from the city, a safe house she had never seen, surrounded by silent, dense woods. She had barely stepped out of the vehicle when the sound of another engine approached. Her breath hitched, her hand flying to the heavy pendant Franco had given her, but the car that pulled into the gravel drive wasn't a tactical assault vehicle. It was a single, vintage sedan, idling with a low, respectful hum. A man emerged from the shadows of the porch. He was elderly, his silver hair groomed to perfection, his charcoal suit tailored with an elegance that spoke of a different era of power. He was an elder, the kind of man who didn't fight with guns but with history itself. Behind him, emerging from the dark, appeared a figure that made Cheryl's knees go weak. Franco. His shirt was shredded, his face bruised and smeared with soot, and he walked with a slight, favoring limp. But he was alive. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, his eyes burning with an intensity that transcended the violence of the night. He didn't speak. He simply reached out, his calloused hands trembling as he took Gia from Cheryl's arms, then pulled both her and Leo into his embrace. The heat of him was a physical barrier against the cold of the world they had just escaped. "It is finished," Franco whispered into her hair, his voice raw with exhaustion. The elder stepped forward, his eyes traveling over the small group with a gaze that held neither judgment nor malice, only a profound, ancient weight. He held a thick, vellum envelope sealed with deep crimson wax, a document that carried the weight of the 5 families. "The life of a dawn is a cycle of blood, Butcho," the elder said, his voice echoing in the stillness of the clearing. "We do not usually permit men to step off the wheel. But the law of the mother is older than the law of the streets. When a stranger of her own volition accepts the child of a dawn as her own, she is protected by the blood oath of the families. You have not just protected your daughter, Franco, you have secured a lineage that has finally found its humanity." He handed the envelope to Franco. The Dawn opened it, his fingers moving with a delicacy that betrayed his rough exterior. Inside were the formal articles of retirement, signed with the seals of the old guard. They were no longer just papers. They were the keys to a life that had been promised to him but never truly existed, a life without the fear of the next knock at the door, the next betrayal in the dark. "I am stepping down," Franco announced, his voice carrying across the drive with a clarity that seemed to banish the last of the shadows. "The leadership goes to the council. I am not a Dawn anymore. I am a father." The elder bowed his head, a gesture of rare, profound respect. "The families recognize the bond you have formed. You are free, Franco Butcho. But remember, you are now bound by a different set of laws. The laws of a father and the laws of a husband. These are much harder to keep than the ones you have left behind." As the elder turned and retreated to his car, the silence returned to the woods, but it was no longer a silence of tension. It was the silence of a new beginning. Franco looked at Cheryl, his gaze softening into something she had only ever seen in the library. He reached out, his hand gently tucking a strand of her hair behind her ear, his touch lingering on her cheek. "I have spent my life building a fortress of lies and iron," he said, his eyes scanning the faces of the 2 children, Gia, who was finally leaning into her father without fear, and Leo, who reached up to touch Franco's beard with a curious, tiny hand. "I thought if I could control everything, I could keep the world from hurting us. But I was wrong." The only way to be truly free was to stop fighting the world and start living in it. Cheryl leaned into his hand, feeling the tremors finally leave his fingers. She realized then that the sacred bond hadn't just saved Gia or protected her, it had forced Franco to evolve. The Mafia boss who had ruled through fear had been dismantled, replaced by a man who had discovered that the greatest power wasn't in taking, but in giving. They stood there for a long moment, a small, fragile family under the vast, uncaring canopy of the stars. The mansion was gone, the empire was a ghost in the wind, and the danger of the past felt like a story told in a different lifetime. Cheryl looked at the house in the distance, simple, quiet, and unguarded. It wasn't a fortress. It was just a home. She took Franco's hand, his gold rings pressing against her skin, a reminder of the man he had been and the man he had become. As they turned toward the porch, the first light of dawn began to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in soft, hopeful colors. The dark angel had finally found the light, and for the first time in their lives, the silence wasn't a threat, it was a promise of peace.